Lyra didn't know that the farewell letter trembling in her hands would shatter the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms. She didn't know that the Alpha King had been carrying her lunar crown for 2 months, waiting for the perfect moment to make her his queen. And she certainly didn't know that by trying to save his kingdom, she was about to destroy them both. The candle flame danced in the pre-dawn darkness, casting shadows across the parchment that blurred with her tears. 3 days. 3 days since she'd overheard Adrian speaking with his council, his voice heavy with resignation as they discussed marriage alliances. "The kingdom needs stability," Lord Chancellor Aldrich had pressed. "A political union could secure our borders." Adrian's response had been barely audible through the heavy oak door, but every word had carved itself into her heart like a blade. "I understand my duties." Her hand shook as she dipped the quill again, the ink bleeding slightly on the rough paper. She had to make him understand, had to make him see that she was setting him free to do what kings must do. "My beloved Adrian," she wrote, and even forming his name made something in her chest pull tight. The bond, always the bond, that golden thread that had connected them from the moment their eyes met across the royal banquet hall 6 months ago. It was pulling now, sensing her distress, trying to call her back to the warmth of his sleeping form just down the hall. She ignored it. She had to. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone." The words looked stark and final on the page, but she forced herself to continue. "I heard you speaking with the council about marriage alliances. You are a king first, and I will not be the weakness that destroys your kingdom." The bond gave another sharp tug, and she doubled over slightly, pressing her free hand to her sternum. This was agony, pure agony, but love sometimes meant letting go, didn't it? Even when every fibre of your being screamed against it, especially then. "What we had was beautiful," she continued, and the memories rushed back unbidden. His hands in her hair the first time he kissed her. The way he'd looked at her when she served wine at the royal banquet, like she was the only person in the room. How he'd pulled out the chair beside his throne and commanded, "Sit," while every noble in the hall stared in shock. She'd been nobody then. A kitchen servant who'd been pressed into service for the evening because one of the regular girls had taken ill. Her dress had been borrowed, too big and pinned hastily. Her hands had been rough from scrubbing floors and washing dishes. But when Adrian looked at her, she'd felt like a queen. "You passed the only test that matters," he'd whispered against her ear that first night, after the other nobles had filed out with their disapproving glances. "You see me, not the crown, not the title, me." Her tears fell freely now, splotching the ink. She set the quill aside and buried her face in her hands. How could she leave him? How could she walk away from the only person who'd ever made her feel like she belonged somewhere? But she'd heard the resignation in his voice when the council spoke of political marriages. She'd seen the weight of the crown pressing down on his shoulders these past months. A king needed a queen who could bring armies to his cause, treaties to his table, gold to his coffers. Not a woman who brought nothing but love. Love wasn't enough. Not when kingdoms hung in the balance. She picked up the quill again, her resolve hardening. "Your duty must come before your heart. Please don't follow me. Love, Lyra." The letter was finished, but she couldn't seem to move. In an hour, maybe 2, he would wake and reach for her. His hand would find cold sheets instead of her warmth. The bond would stretch and strain as the distance between them grew, causing them both pain that would build until it was nearly unbearable. But it would fade eventually. It had to. She stood on unsteady legs, legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her travelling pack was already prepared, hidden beneath her bed for 3 days now. Simple clothes, her few personal possessions, and the small pouch of coins she'd been saving from her allowance as Adrian's. What had she been? Not his wife, though they'd shared a bed for months. Not officially his queen, though he treated her like one. Not even formally his mate, though the bond sang between them constantly. Just Lyra, kitchen girl who'd risen above her station for a brief, shining moment. She pulled on her worn travelling cloak, the one she'd arrived in all those months ago. It smelled like the stables now instead of his scent, and that seemed fitting somehow. She was returning to who she'd been before he'd claimed her heart. The castle corridors were empty at this hour, just as she'd known they would be. She'd walked these halls as a servant long enough to know every guard rotation, every creaking floorboard to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on her that her lowly origins were what would allow her to escape the palace undetected. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone as she slipped through the servants' passages, past the kitchens where she'd once worked, past the laundry where she'd first caught Adrian's attention when he'd found her singing while folding linens. Every step took her further from the only home she'd ever truly known, and the bond protested with increasing violence. By the time she reached the postern gate, she was doubled over with pain, one hand pressed against the wall for support. The bond was screaming now, a constant ache that radiated from her chest through every limb. This was what happened when mates separated. The pain would build until it drove them back together, or drove them mad. She fumbled with the gate's simple lock, her fingers clumsy with tears she couldn't stop. The mechanism clicked open, and suddenly she was outside the castle walls, breathing free air for the first time in months, but freedom felt like drowning. The forest loomed ahead, dark and welcoming in its anonymity. She could lose herself in there, become nobody again. Just another traveller on the roads, another face in the crowd at the next town. Adrian would forget her eventually. He'd marry some perfect princess who could give him the alliances he needed, bear him the heirs his kingdom required. He'd be happy. She told herself that as she stumbled into the trees, following the old hunting path she'd walked with him just last week. The bond pulled tighter with every step, but she forced herself forward. This was love. This was sacrifice. This was doing what was right instead of what felt good. The first light of dawn was touching the horizon when she finally had to stop. The pain was unbearable now, a living thing that clawed at her insides and left her gasping against the trunk of an ancient oak. She could feel him stirring in their bed, could feel the exact moment when he reached for her and found emptiness. His roar of anguish echoed across the miles between them, carried on the supernatural connection that bound them. She felt it like a physical blow, and for a moment her resolve nearly cracked completely. But she stayed where she was, gripping the tree bark until her nails broke, letting the pain wash over her in waves. This was the price of loving a king. This was what it meant to choose his happiness over her own. The bond would settle eventually. The pain would fade to a dull ache, then to nothing. They would both heal, and he would understand that she'd done this for him. She had to believe that. Because if she didn't, if she let herself think for even one moment that she was making the worst mistake of her life, she would turn around and run back to him. And then his kingdom truly would fall, dragged down by a kitchen girl who'd foolishly thought she could be a queen. Adrian's hand swept across cold sheets, searching for the warmth that should have been there. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin as consciousness crept in, some primitive instinct already screaming that something was wrong. The bed felt vast and empty, the silence too complete. His eyes snapped open. "Lyra!" His voice came out rough with sleep and growing panic. The bond, usually a steady thrum of contentment between them, felt stretched thin, strained, like a golden thread pulled to its breaking point. The pillow beside him held only her scent and a folded piece of parchment. No. His hands shook as he reached for the letter, and he knew with absolute certainty what it would say before he even unfolded it. The bond was screaming now, a constant ache that confirmed his worst fears. She was gone. His mate, his everything, had vanished like morning mist. "My beloved Adrian," the letter began, and each word felt like a physical blow. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I heard you speaking with the council about marriage alliances. You are a king first, and I will not be the weakness that destroys your kingdom." The parchment crumpled in his fists as a roar tore from his throat, shaking the very foundations of the castle. The sound wasn't entirely human. His wolf was clawing to the surface, desperate to hunt, to chase, to bring back what belonged to them. What we had was beautiful, but your duty must come before your heart. Please don't follow me. Love, Lyra. Please don't follow her. She might as well have asked him to stop breathing. He shifted without conscious thought, bones crackling and reshaping as his wolf form exploded from his human skin. The letter fluttered to the floor as he bounded toward the window, powerful muscles bunching beneath his dark fur. Her scent trail was faint but traceable, leading toward the forest. She had hours on him, but he was faster, much faster. The massive wolf crashed through the gardens, past startled guards who scrambled out of his way. They would follow soon. His beta Marcus would rally the pack the moment he sensed his alpha's distress through their mental link. But Adrian couldn't wait, wouldn't wait. Every second that passed was another second she moved further away, another twist of agony through their bond. Her trail led to the postern gate, and the wolf's lip curled back in something between anguish and admiration. Clever girl. She'd used her knowledge of the castle's servant passages to slip away undetected. The same lowly origins she believed made her unworthy had been the key to her escape, but she'd misunderstood everything, everything. The memory hit him like a physical blow as he raced through the forest, following her scent deeper into the trees. 3 days ago, when she'd overheard that damned council meeting, Lord Chancellor Aldrich pressing him about marriage alliances, rattling off names of foreign princesses like items on a shopping list. The kingdom needs stability, Aldrich had insisted. A political union could secure our borders, bring us trade agreements with the Eastern Territories. And Adrian had responded with barely contained fury. I understand my duties. What he'd meant was that he understood his duty to reject every single proposal, to send every ambassador home empty-handed. What he'd meant was that he already had his queen, and no political alliance could ever compare to the woman who'd claimed his soul the moment she looked up at him with those defiant, beautiful eyes. But she hadn't stayed to hear him continue, hadn't heard him tell Aldrich in no uncertain terms that he'd sooner burn his kingdom to the ground than marry anyone but Lyra. She'd slipped away from the door, carrying only the first half of a conversation that had sealed her fate and broken both their hearts. The wolf stumbled, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the misunderstanding. He'd been planning to announce their formal mating ceremony at the next full moon, had been working with the royal jeweller for weeks on her crown, a delicate thing of silver and moonstones that would sit perfectly on her dark hair. He'd carried the betrothal contract in his desk drawer for 2 months, waiting for the courage to ask if she'd have him not just as her lover, but as her mate for life. And instead she'd run. His powerful legs ate up the miles, but her head start meant the distance between them wasn't closing fast enough. The bond stretched and strained with every step, sending waves of agony through both of them. He could feel her pain echoing through their connection, could sense her stumbling as the separation grew more unbearable. "Hold on," he projected desperately, though he wasn't sure she could hear him at this distance. "Hold on, love, I'm coming." The forest blurred past him in shades of green and brown, but all he could focus on was her scent growing stronger. She'd stopped here, by this stream, to drink and rest. The lingering traces of her tears made his wolf whimper with distress. She was in agony too, fighting their bond with every step, forcing herself forward despite the pain that was surely crippling her by now. Stubborn, impossible, beautiful woman. Did she really think he'd choose duty over love? Did she truly believe there was any force in 7 kingdoms that could make him give her up? The trail continued east, toward the port city, and his heart sank. If she reached the docks, she could disappear onto any number of ships heading to God's new where. He could lose her completely, and the thought made his wolf howl in desperation. But there was something else mixed with her scent now. Blood, just a trace, but enough to send him into a near-feral state of panic. She was hurt. His mate was injured and alone, pushing herself beyond her limits in some misguided attempt to save a kingdom that meant nothing to him without her in it. The wolf ran harder, his massive paws pounding against the forest floor. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of horses, Marcus and the others finally catching up. But they were too far back to help, and this was something he had to do alone anyway. She was his mate, his responsibility, his heart walking around outside his body. And he'd be damned if he let her slip away based on a misunderstanding that could have been cleared up with a single conversation. The scent trail led to a clearing where she'd rested again, and he could see the impression her body had left in the grass. She'd curled up against a tree, probably overwhelmed by the bond pain, and he could smell the salt of her tears soaked into the earth. The image of her alone and suffering made something primal and protective roar to life in his chest. He was going to find her. He was going to bring her home. And then he was going to spend the rest of their very long lives making sure she never doubted her place beside him again. The sun was climbing higher, painting the forest in dappled gold, and her trail was getting fresher. She was weakening, slowing down, the bond separation taking its toll on her mortal body. His wolf form could endure the pain longer, but she was fighting a losing battle against a supernatural force that demanded their reunion. Good. Let the bond work in his favour for once. Let it drag her back to him kicking and screaming if necessary, because he wasn't giving up. Not on her, not on them, not on the future he'd been dreaming of since the night she'd first smiled at him across a crowded banquet hall. The port city was still miles ahead, but he was gaining ground with every stride. And when he found her, not if, when, he was going to make absolutely certain she understood the truth. He wasn't a king who'd happened to fall in love. He was a man who'd found his mate and would move heaven and earth to keep her. The crown was just an accessory. She was everything that mattered. The trading post appeared through the morning mist like a mirage, its weathered walls and crooked chimney the most beautiful sight Lyra had ever seen. Her legs gave out the moment she reached the wooden steps, and she collapsed against the railing, gasping as another wave of bond pain crashed over her. How long had she been walking? Hours? It felt like days. The supernatural ache in her chest had grown steadily worse, until every breath was an effort and every step felt like walking through molten glass. This was what happened when mates separated. She'd heard the stories whispered among the older servants, tales of wolves who'd gone mad from the pain or died from the strain. She wouldn't die. She couldn't. Adrian needed her to live, even if he didn't need her to stay. The innkeeper who answered her knock was a weathered woman with kind eyes that immediately softened when she saw Lyra's condition. "Gods above, girl, you look half dead. Come in, come in." Lyra stumbled through the doorway, her vision blurring at the edges. I need passage to the port city, and a horse if you have one." "What you need is rest and a hot meal," the woman said firmly, guiding her to a chair by the fire. "When's the last time you ate something?" She couldn't remember. The thought of food made her stomach turn, though she knew she needed strength for the journey ahead. "Please, I can pay." Her fingers fumbled at her wrist, working loose the silver bracelet Adrian had given her on their 3-month anniversary. It was delicate work, etched with wolves running through forest scenes, and it had cost him a small fortune. Her heart clenched as she placed it on the table. "For a horse and supplies, it's real silver." The innkeeper's eyes widened as she picked up the bracelet, examining the intricate craftsmanship. "This is worth far more than a horse, girl. This is royal work. Where did you—" She stopped, taking in Lyra's fine features, her bearing despite her exhaustion. "You're running from someone." "I'm running to save someone," Lyra whispered, and it felt like the truth. She was saving Adrian from his own heart, from the impossible choice between love and duty. The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll have my boy saddle our mare. She's not much to look at, but she's steady, and I'll pack you food for the road." She paused, her voice gentling. But child, whatever you're running from, sometimes the thing we think will destroy us is the very thing that saves us. If only it were that simple. An hour later, Lyra was mounted on a sturdy brown mare, a pack of supplies secured behind her. The bond pain had eased slightly during her rest, but she knew it would return with interest once she started moving again. Every mile she put between herself and Adrian was a mile closer to agony, but also a mile closer to his freedom. The memory rose unbidden as she urged the mare into a steady trot. 6 months ago, the royal banquet that had changed everything. She'd been pressed into service when one of the regular girls fell ill, her hands scrubbed raw from kitchen work, her best dress borrowed and hastily pinned to fit. She'd been terrified of making a mistake, of dropping something or spilling wine on some important lord's fine clothes. Instead, she'd found herself staring into the most beautiful amber eyes she'd ever seen, belonging to a man who commanded the attention of everyone in the room simply by existing, the Alpha King. She'd known who he was, of course, but seeing him up close had stolen her breath completely. Dark hair that caught the candlelight, strong hands that looked like they could be gentle or deadly depending on his mood, and a smile that had made her forget her own name. "Sit," he'd commanded, pulling out the chair beside his throne, and every conversation in the hall had died to stunned silence. "Your Majesty, I'm just serving. I said sit." His voice had been soft but absolute, and something in her chest had responded to it like a tuning fork struck just right. The golden thread, though she hadn't understood what it was then. She'd sat, hyper-aware of every noble eye fixed on them, every whispered conversation behind fans and goblets. But Adrian had acted as if they were the only two people in the room, asking about her work, her family, her dreams with genuine interest that had made her forget her lowly station. "What do you want from life?" he'd asked as the evening wound down, his amber eyes serious in the flickering candlelight. "To belong somewhere," she'd answered without thinking, then flushed at her honesty. His smile had been devastating. "Then stay. Belong here." And God's help her she had. She'd given up her position in the kitchens, moved into rooms in the royal wing, let herself believe that a kitchen girl could somehow become worthy of a king's attention. For 6 months she'd lived in a dream where love could conquer the vast gulf between their stations. But dreams always ended when duty called. The mare stumbled slightly, jolting her back to the present. The bond was pulling tighter again, a constant ache that made her lean forward in the saddle. Adrian was following her. Of course he was. His wolf would be able to track her scent for miles, and he was nothing if not determined. She pushed the horse harder, though guilt twisted in her stomach at the animal's laboured breathing. She had to reach the port city before he caught her, had to put the ocean between them before she lost her resolve completely. Because if he found her, if he looked at her with those amber eyes and commanded her to come home, she would. Gods above, she would follow him anywhere, even if it meant watching his kingdom crumble around them both. Meanwhile, miles behind her, Adrian's wolf was closing the distance with supernatural speed. He'd found the trading post easily, following her scent to the weathered building where it mixed with the smell of horses and leather. The innkeeper had remembered her, of course. A beautiful girl in distress wasn't easily forgotten. Sad thing she was, the woman had told him, after he'd shifted back to human form and borrowed clothes from her husband. Traded the most beautiful silver bracelet I've ever seen for a horse and supplies, said she was running to save someone. Adrian's heart had clenched as he recognised the bracelet, his 3-month gift to her, chosen because the running wolves reminded him of the freedom he saw in her spirit. She'd given up something precious to him to fund her escape. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. "Which direction?" he'd asked, though he already knew. "East, toward the port. But, sir, if you're following her, she's in a bad way. Whatever's between you two, it's tearing her apart." He'd shifted back to wolf form without another word, the scent trail leading him deeper into the forest. She was pushing herself too hard, driving toward the coast with desperate determination that would likely kill her before the bond separation did. Stubborn woman. beautiful, impossible, stubborn woman who thought she was saving him by destroying them both. But he was gaining ground. The horse she'd purchased was steady but slow, and his wolf form could maintain a pace that would exhaust a dozen normal animals. The pain in his chest was building to unbearable levels, but he embraced it. Every stab of agony meant she was still alive, still fighting their connection with all her considerable will. He would find her before she reached the docks. He would catch her before she could board some ship bound for the edges of the world, and then he would make her listen to the truth she should have heard 3 days ago. The memory of that conversation with his council played on repeat in his mind as he ran. Aldrich pressing for political marriages, rattling off names of foreign princesses like Adrian, should be grateful for the options. The other lords nodding along, discussing trade agreements and military alliances, as if his heart were a commodity to be bartered. "You are 28 years old, your Majesty," Aldrich had said. "The kingdom needs heirs, needs the stability of a royal marriage." "I understand my duties," Adrian had replied, his voice carefully controlled. What he'd meant was that his duty was to his people, not to some political chess game that would see him married to a stranger. "Then you'll consider the Princess of Valethorn. Her dowry would fund our military expansion for the next decade." "I'll consider telling her father that his daughter deserves better than a king whose heart belongs to another," Adrian had said, his patience finally snapping. "I'll consider explaining that I'd rather burn this kingdom to ash than dishonour my mate by taking another woman to my bed." But Lyra had been gone by then, carrying only half the story that had sealed both their fates. The wolf's powerful legs devoured the miles, following her scent through dense forest and across babbling streams. She'd stopped to rest twice, both times beside water sources, and the lingering traces of her tears made his heart ache with desperate longing. "Hold on," he projected again, pouring all his love and determination into the thought. "Hold on, my brave girl, I'm almost there." The sun was climbing toward its peak when he finally heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats ahead. His wolf put on a burst of speed that should have been impossible, and suddenly there she was, a small figure bent over the neck of a labouring horse, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. She was beautiful even in her desperation, even in her pain. She was everything he'd ever wanted and everything he'd never known he needed, and she was trying to leave him because she thought it was what he required, as if he could ever require anything but her. The distance between them was closing rapidly now, and he could smell her exhaustion, her determination, her anguish. Soon she would sense him behind her, would realise that all her suffering had been for nothing because he would never, ever let her go. His mate, his queen, his stubborn, self-sacrificing, perfect woman who thought she wasn't worthy of a crown that had been made for her alone. She was about to learn otherwise. The port city of Sea Haven sprawled before Lyra like salvation and damnation rolled into one. Salt-tinged air filled her lungs as the exhausted mare stumbled down the cobblestone streets, past merchants hawking their wares and sailors preparing for departure. Her whole body ached from hours in the saddle, but the bond pain was worse, a constant crushing weight in her chest that made every breath a struggle. She had to find passage, had to get on a ship before Adrian caught up to her, because she could feel him now, a burning presence at the edge of her consciousness growing stronger with every passing moment. He was close, too close. The harbour was chaos personified, a maze of masts and rigging that blocked out portions of the afternoon sky. Ships of every size bobbed at anchor, from sleek merchant vessels to weathered fishing boats. Her desperate gaze landed on a mid-sized trading ship where sailors were loading the last of their cargo. "Please," she gasped, sliding down from her horse so abruptly that she nearly collapsed. The captain, a grizzled man with sun-weathered skin, looked her up and down with shrewd eyes. "Passage to where, girl?" "Anywhere. The mainland territories. I can pay." She fumbled for her remaining coins, praying they would be enough. The captain's expression shifted, and something calculating entered his gaze. "Aye, I can take you. Ship leaves with the evening tide, but the price just went up." Behind her she heard it, the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. A wolf's howl, wild and desperate and heartbroken, echoing across the city from the forest edge. Adrian, he'd found the city, found her trail. "How much?" she asked frantically. "Everything you have," the captain said with a cold smile, "and consider yourself lucky I'm not asking for more." She emptied her coin purse without hesitation, hands shaking as she counted out every piece of silver and copper she possessed. The captain nodded, satisfied, and gestured toward the gangplank. "Welcome aboard the Siren's Call. We sail at sunset." Lyra stumbled up the narrow wooden plank, the bond pulling so violently now that she had to grip the rope railing to keep from falling. The ship rocked gently beneath her feet, and for one horrifying moment she thought she might be sick. But she forced herself to stay upright, to move toward the ship's rail where she could see the city spreading out below. And that's when she saw him. Adrian stood at the harbour's edge, still in human form but barely. His clothes were torn from his frantic shift back from Wolf, his dark hair wild, his amber eyes scanning the dozens of ships with desperate intensity. Even from this distance she could see the anguish written across his face, the way he held himself like a man in physical pain. Because he was in pain. The same crushing agony that was slowly killing her was tearing him apart too, and it was all her fault. Their eyes met across the water, and the bond between them snapped taut like a physical blow. She gasped, doubling over as the connection flared to life with renewed intensity. His name fell from her lips before she could stop it. "Adrian." He heard her somehow, over the noise of the busy harbour, and his head whipped toward her ship. For a moment they simply stared at each other, two souls torn apart by misunderstanding and duty, separated by mere yards of dark water that might as well have been an ocean. Then he was moving, pushing through the crowd with supernatural speed, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Lyra, you forgot to say goodbye properly." The words hit her like arrows, each one finding its mark in her already shattered heart. She gripped the ship's rail until her knuckles went white, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to jump into the water and swim back to him. "This is goodbye, Adrian," she called back, her voice breaking on his name. "Your kingdom needs you." He reached the dock directly below her ship, and she could see the wild desperation in his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as if he was fighting the urge to shift back to his wolf form and simply leap onto the vessel. "I need you," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "The kingdom means nothing without you in it." He was pulling off his shirt, preparing to dive into the harbour when they appeared. City guards, at least a dozen of them, surrounding him with drawn weapons. Their leader, a man in fine clothes that marked him as nobility, stepped forward with a satisfied smile. "By order of the Council of Lords," the man announced, his voice carrying clearly across the water, "King Adrian of the Northern Territories, you are under arrest for abandoning your royal duties and bringing shame upon the crown." Lyra's blood turned to ice. This was wrong. This was all wrong. The council was supposed to be advising Adrian, not arresting him, unless. "You were right to leave, girl," the ship's captain said quietly beside her, and there was something oily in his voice that made her skin crawl. "Though perhaps you should have done it sooner, might have saved us all some trouble." She spun to face him, her heart hammering with sudden understanding. "You're working with them, the council lords. They paid you to make sure I couldn't come back." His smile was cold and satisfied. "Paid me very well, as a matter of fact. They've been waiting for an opportunity like this for months, wanting to remove a king they considered too soft, too distracted by pretty servants to rule properly. Your little love story gave them exactly the excuse they needed." Down on the dock, Adrian was fighting. Not to escape, Lyra could see that he was holding back, not wanting to hurt men who were only following orders. But his wolf was close to the surface, his control fraying as the bond between them stretched to its breaking point. "Release me!" he growled, his voice carrying the authority of an alpha, even surrounded by enemies. "I am your king." "You were our king," the council lord corrected. "Now you're a man who chose personal desires over the good of the realm. The council has voted. You are unfit to rule." "No!" The word tore from Lyra's throat as she watched them overwhelm Adrian through sheer numbers. Silver chains, the only thing that could hold a wolf shifter, appeared as if by magic, wrapping around his wrists and ankles. The metal burned his skin, but he barely seemed to notice, his wild gaze fixed on her ship as it began to pull away from the dock. "Lyra!" His voice was anguish and fury and desperate love all rolled into one. "Fight them! Fight for us!" The ship was moving now, caught by the evening tide that was carrying them toward open water. The distance between them grew with each passing second, and Lyra felt something inside her chest begin to tear apart. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd left to save his kingdom, not destroy it. She'd sacrificed their love to preserve his throne, and instead she'd given his enemies exactly what they needed to take everything from him. "Turn the ship around," she demanded, whirling on the captain with fury blazing in her eyes. "Turn it around now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," he said with mock regret. "We have a schedule to keep, and my employers were very specific about making sure you reach the mainland safely, far away from any complications." Adrian's howl of rage and heartbreak echoed across the water as the silver chains dragged him to his knees. Even from this distance, she could see the burns on his skin, could feel his pain through their bond like acid in her veins. The guards were hauling him away, and she was helpless to stop it. "You don't understand," she said desperately, turning to face the captain with tears streaming down her face. "He's innocent. He never wanted political marriages. He was planning to refuse them all." "Perhaps he was," the captain agreed with a shrug. "But it doesn't matter now. The council has what they wanted, a reason to remove an inconvenient king and install someone more manageable. Your lover's noble intentions died the moment you ran away." The city was shrinking behind them now, the harbour becoming a collection of distant lights as full darkness settled over the water. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Adrian was being imprisoned by men who'd used her own love for him as a weapon. The bond between them was stretching to its absolute limit, sending waves of agony through both their bodies that would only get worse as the miles accumulated. She gripped the ship's rail and made a choice that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. "I'm going back." The captain laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humour. "I'm afraid that's not an option, my dear. My orders were quite explicit. You don't set foot on dry land until we reach the mainland territories." Lyra looked out at the dark water rushing past the ship's hull, calculating distances and currents, and her own chances of survival. The water was cold, the swim back to shore would be brutal, and she had no guarantee she could even make it to the harbour alive. But Adrian was in chains because of her. His kingdom was falling because she'd run away. Their love had been turned into a weapon against everything they'd tried to protect. She thought about the first night they'd spent together, when he'd whispered against her skin that she was his anchor, his reason for being a better king than his father had been. She thought about the way he looked at her like she was precious beyond measure, like she was everything he'd never known he needed. And she thought about the crown he'd mentioned once in passing, the lunar crown that had been gathering dust in the royal vault for 3 generations. "Waiting for the right woman," he'd said with a smile that had made her heart skip. "Waiting for you." She'd run because she thought she wasn't worthy of that crown, wasn't strong enough to be the queen his people deserved. But watching him being dragged away in chains while she sailed to safety, she realised she'd had it backwards all along. She wasn't too weak to be his queen. She'd been too afraid to fight for the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Not any more. Lyra swung her legs over the ship's rail, and before the captain could react, she was diving headfirst into the dark, churning waters of the harbour. The The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending shockwaves through her already aching body. But the bond flared to life as she struck out toward shore, pulling her forward like a golden rope thrown to a drowning woman. Adrian was somewhere in that city, chained and imprisoned, and believing she'd abandoned him to save herself. Time to prove him wrong. The harbour water was brutal, colder than anything Lyra had ever experienced, salt burning her throat as waves crashed over her head. But the bond pulled her forward like a lighthouse beam, growing stronger with every stroke toward shore. She could feel Adrian's anguish through their connection, his rage at being chained while she sailed away, and it gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Her waterlogged dress dragged at her limbs, threatening to pull her under, but she fought against the current with desperate determination. Behind her she could hear shouts from the ship's crew, the captain's furious voice carrying across the water as he realised his valuable cargo had literally jumped ship. Let him rage. She had a king to save. By the time she hauled herself onto the harbour dock, her lungs were burning and her whole body shook with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Somewhere in this maze of buildings, Adrian was imprisoned, and every second she wasted was another second his enemies had to consolidate their power. The Port Authority building loomed ahead, a squat stone structure that reeked of corruption and silver-burned wolf. She could smell it now, Adrian's scent mixed with pain and fury, the metallic tang of the chains that were slowly poisoning his supernatural system. The front entrance was heavily guarded, but Lyra had spent 6 months learning castle layouts, understanding how servants move through buildings unseen. Every official structure was the same, built by the same architects, following the same basic patterns. There would be service entrances, storage rooms, passages designed for people nobody noticed. She slipped around to the back of the building, her wet hair plastered to her skull, her dress leaving a trail of seawater on the cobblestones. The service door was locked, but the lock was old and simple. A hairpin and 30 seconds of careful work, and she was inside. The corridors were dimly lit and narrow, designed for servants carrying supplies or cleaning equipment. She followed Adrian's scent deeper into the building, past storage rooms and offices, until she heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead. "Told you this would work," someone was saying. Lord Chancellor Aldrich, his voice smug with satisfaction. The girl was always his weakness. Remove her, and he becomes reckless, desperate, easy to trap. "And you're certain she won't return?" Another voice, one she didn't recognise. "The captain has his orders. She'll be halfway to the mainland territories by morning, and by then it won't matter. We'll have Adrian declared unfit to rule, install Prince Garrett as regent, and the kingdom will finally have the stable leadership it needs." Lyra's blood boiled. They'd used her love for Adrian as a weapon, turned her desperate sacrifice into the key to destroying everything he'd built. But they'd underestimated one crucial thing. She wasn't just some lovesick girl who would disappear quietly into the night. She was his mate, his Luna, and she was done running. The holding cells were in the basement, just as she'd expected. 2 guards flanked the entrance, but they were relaxed, confident in their victory. They didn't expect a dripping wet woman to emerge from the shadows like a vengeful spirit. The first guard went down without a sound, a candlestick from a nearby table connecting with his skull before he could even turn around. The second had time to open his mouth, but Lyra's fist caught him in the throat, cutting off his shout before it could form. 6 months of Adrian insisting she learn to defend herself had apparently paid off. She grabbed the keys from the unconscious guard's belt and ran down the narrow stone steps. The basement reeked of dampness and despair, but Adrian's scent was stronger here, mixed with the acrid smell of silver burns. "Adrian," she called softly, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Lyra!" His response was immediate, disbelieving. "Gods above, please tell me I'm not hallucinating from silver poisoning." She found him in the last cell, chained to the wall, with heavy silver manacles that had left angry red burns on his wrists and ankles. His clothes were torn, his dark hair dishevelled, but his amber eyes blazed with fierce joy when he saw her. "You came back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I couldn't leave you," she whispered, fumbling with the keys. "I couldn't leave you to face this alone." The silver burned her fingers as she worked to unlock his chains, but she barely noticed the pain. All that mattered was freeing him, getting those terrible restraints off his skin before they did permanent damage. "The council," he said as the first manacle fell away. "They used your departure as an excuse." "I know. I heard them talking." The second chain fell, and he flexed his hands, wincing as circulation returned to his burned wrists. "Adrian, I'm so sorry. I thought I was saving your kingdom, but I handed it to your enemies instead." He caught her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You came back. That's all that matters. You came back to me." "Always," she whispered. "I'll always come back to you." They could hear footsteps on the stairs above. Someone had discovered the unconscious guards. Adrian's eyes hardened, his wolf rising to the surface as his protective instincts flared to life. "Stay behind me," he commanded, but Lyra shook her head. "No, we fight together or we don't fight at all." His smile was fierce and proud and absolutely devastating. "That's my Luna." The guards who came down those stairs expecting to find a chained king instead found a mated pair ready for war. Adrian's wolf strength, no longer dampened by silver, made him a force of nature, but Lyra surprised them all. The quiet servant girl they dismissed as harmless fought like a woman possessed, using every dirty trick Adrian had taught her and a few her desperation invented on the spot. They carved through the guards like a blade through silk, the bond between them making them move as one entity, anticipating each other's actions with supernatural precision. By the time they reached the basement stairs, 6 men lay unconscious behind them. "The city centre," Adrian said as they climbed. "They'll be addressing the people, trying to legitimize their coup. If we can reach the crowd—" "We expose them," Lyra finished. "Show everyone what really happened." They emerged from the building into chaos. Word of Adrian's escape had spread quickly, and the city centre was packed with people. Some supporters, some council loyalists, all of them confused and frightened by the night's events. Lord Chancellor Aldrich stood on a raised platform, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Abandoned his duties for base desires, King Adrian has proven himself unfit to rule, caring more for a servant girl than for the welfare of his people. Funny thing about that, Adrian's voice cut through the night like a blade, and the crowd turned as one to see him emerge from the shadows, with Lyra at his side. "I was never given a chance to explain my position." Aldrich's face went white as Adrian stepped into the torchlight, his royal bearing unmistakable despite his dishevelled appearance. "You were arrested for abandoning." "I was arrested," Adrian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "for refusing to marry foreign princesses when I already had my queen." He pulled Lyra forward, and she saw him reach into his torn jacket, producing something that made her heart stop. A crown. Delicate silver set with moonstones that caught the torchlight and threw it back in scattered rainbows. The Luna crown, the one that had been waiting in the royal vault for 3 generations. "I present your Luna Queen," Adrian announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The woman I would die for, live for, and rule beside. The woman who sacrificed everything she thought she wanted to save a kingdom that was never in danger." The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the gathered people as Adrian placed the crown on Lyra's head. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her alone. "I ran," Lyra said, her voice shaking but carrying clearly across the square. "Because I thought his duty mattered more than our love. I was wrong. Love is the duty that matters most. A king who doesn't understand love will never understand his people." Aldrich was sputtering, trying to regain control of the narrative, but the crowd was turning. They could see the truth written in Adrian and Lyra's faces, could feel the love and determination radiating from the mated pair like heat from a forge. "She's nobody!" Aldrich shouted desperately. "A servant, unworthy of—" "She is everything," Adrian interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "And any man who says otherwise can take it up with me personally." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly the square was filled with Adrian's supporters, Marcus leading a contingent of loyal guards, nobles who had always backed their king, common folk who remembered Adrian's fairness and compassion. The council's coup was crumbling before their eyes. "You forgot to say goodbye properly," Adrian said softly, pulling Lyra close as the crowd cheered around them. "Because this isn't goodbye, this is hello forever." "Hello forever," she whispered against his lips, and when he kissed her, the bond between them blazed to life like a star being born. The kingdom was theirs, the crown was hers, and for the first time since she'd written that terrible letter, Lyra truly believed she was worthy of both. 3 weeks later, Lyra woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of their bedchamber, and Adrian's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her closer against his warm chest. The bond hummed between them, no longer the source of agony it had been during their separation, but a constant thread of contentment that coloured every moment with quiet joy. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured against her neck, his voice rough with sleep and affection. "Good morning, my king," she replied, turning in his arms to face the man who had moved heaven and earth to bring her home. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of change. The coup conspirators had been dealt with, some exiled, others imprisoned, Lord Chancellor Aldrich stripped of his titles and banished from the kingdom forever. In their place, Adrian had appointed advisers who understood that a king's first duty was to his people, not to political machinations that served only the wealthy and power-hungry. "I have something to show you," Adrian said, reaching toward the nightstand where a folded piece of parchment waited. Lyra's heart clenched as she recognized it, the farewell letter she'd left all those weeks ago, the one that had started their desperate chase across the kingdom. "Adrian, you don't need to—" "I kept it," he said softly, unfolding the tear-stained paper. "Read it again, now, with everything we know." She took the letter with trembling fingers, scanning the words she'd written in desperation and heartbreak. "My beloved Adrian, by the time you read this I'll be gone. I heard you speaking with the council about marriage alliances. You are a king first, and I will not be the weakness that destroys your kingdom." Her voice broke on the last words, and Adrian caught her chin gently, tilting her face up to meet his amber eyes. "Do you see it now?" he asked, "the flaw in your reasoning?" "I thought I was protecting your kingdom," she whispered. "You were protecting something that was never in danger," he said, taking the letter from her hands. "Because you are not my weakness, Lyra. You never were. You are my strength." He stood and walked to the fireplace, and she watched as he held the parchment over the flames. "No more goodbyes," he said, as the paper caught fire, curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash. "Only hellos and see you soons." The simple ceremony they'd had a week ago had been perfect. Nothing like the grand political spectacle Lyra had once imagined royal weddings to be. Just them, their closest friends, and vows that had been written from the heart rather than dictated by tradition. "I promise never to run from our love again," she had whispered as he slid the simple silver band onto her finger. "I promise to always chase you home if you do," he had replied, his own vow making her laugh through her tears. Now she wore 2 rings, the simple wedding band they'd chosen together, and beside it a more elaborate piece set with moonstones that matched her crown. Queen's rings, but she was still getting used to that title. "The council meeting," she said, remembering their morning obligations. "Lord Marcus wanted to discuss the new trade agreements with the Eastern Territories." "Lord Marcus can wait," Adrian said, returning to bed and pulling her back into his arms. "The Eastern Territories have waited 3 months for these negotiations. They can wait another hour." She laughed, the sound bright and free in the morning air. "That's no way for a responsible king to talk." "I am a responsible king," he said seriously, his hands framing her face. "I'm responsible for my people's welfare, for the kingdom's prosperity, and for my queen's happiness, in that order." "Your queen is very happy," she assured him, and it was true. The bone-deep contentment she felt now was nothing like the desperate, fragile joy she'd known before. This was solid, built on truth and understanding, and the kind of love that could survive separation and misunderstanding and come back stronger. The morning passed in lazy contentment, but eventually duty did call. They dressed together, Lyra in a simple gown of deep blue silk that brought out the silver of her crown, Adrian in the black and gold that marked him as king. But when she reached for the delicate lunar crown, he stopped her. "Leave it," he said. "Today you're just my wife, helping me bore a bunch of old men to tears with trade negotiations." "Just your wife," she repeated with raised eyebrows. His smile was devastating. "Never just anything. You're my wife, my queen, my mate, my anchor, my heart. But today we're simply Adrian and Lyra, working together to make our kingdom a better place." The council chambers had been restructured along with the council itself. Gone was the massive oak table that had separated the king from his advisers, replaced with a round table where everyone sat as equals. Lyra had her own chair now, her own voice in the proceedings, and if some of the older lords still struggled with the concept of a queen who'd once served wine at royal functions, well, they were learning to adapt. "The Eastern Territories are willing to reduce tariffs on grain imports," Lord Marcus reported, "in exchange for preferential treatment on our silver exports." "What do you think?" Adrian asked, turning to Lyra with the same serious attention he gave his most experienced advisers. She'd spent the past 3 weeks learning everything she could about trade routes and economic policy, determined to be worthy of the trust he'd placed in her. "The grain imports would help with the food shortages in the northern provinces, but we should negotiate for a sunset clause on the silver preferences. If our mines become more productive, we'll want the flexibility to renegotiate." Adrian's smile was proud and warm. "Agreed. Marcus, propose a 3-year term with renegotiation options." The meeting continued for 2 hours, covering everything from infrastructure improvements to diplomatic relationships with neighbouring kingdoms. Lyra contributed to every discussion, her perspective as someone who'd lived among the common people, bringing insights that the noble-born council members often missed. When they finally adjourned, Adrian caught her hand as they walked back toward their chambers. "You realise what you've done, don't you?" he said. "Helped negotiate more favourable trade terms?" "Prove to everyone in that room that I made the right choice," he said, stopping in the middle of the corridor to pull her into his arms. "Not just in loving you, but in trusting you with the kingdom's future." That evening they walked through the castle gardens as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The same gardens where Lyra had once worked as a servant, tending to flowers she'd never imagined she'd one day walk among as an equal. "Any regrets?" Adrian asked as they paused beside the fountain where he'd first kissed her. "Only one," she said, and his expression grew concerned until she continued. "I regret that it took me so long to realise that love isn't something that weakens a kingdom. It's something that strengthens it. And now? Now I know that a king who doesn't understand love will never understand his people," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken in the city square weeks ago. "And a queen who's afraid to claim her place beside him can never serve them properly." 6 months later, Lyra sat in their favourite spot in the garden, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her growing belly, watching Adrian read to their unborn child from a book of ancient fairy tales. His dramatic voices for the various characters made her laugh, the sound carrying across the peaceful evening air. "And they lived happily ever after," he finished, closing the book and pressing a gentle kiss to her stomach. "Though I think our story is much better." "Because it's real?" she asked. "Because it's ours," he replied, his hand covering hers on her belly. because we chose each other every day, even when it was hard, even when duty and fear and misunderstanding tried to pull us apart. The bond between them pulsed with shared contentment, carrying their love back and forth like a gift exchanged between souls. Their child kicked gently beneath their joined hands, as if already eager to join the family they'd built from ashes and misunderstanding and stubborn, defiant love. "I love you," Lyra whispered, the words as natural as breathing. "I love you too," Adrian replied, leaning up to kiss her softly. "My queen, my mate, my everything." As the stars came out above them, painting the kingdom in silver light, they sat in perfect peace. Two people who'd almost lost everything because they'd been too afraid to trust in love, now building a future that would outlast kingdoms and crowns and every earthly thing except the bond that connected their hearts. Forever wasn't just a promise anymore, it was their reality. Where are you listening from? I love hearing about couples who choose each other every day, who fight for their love even when the world tries to pull them apart. If you'd like to support more stories like this, please subscribe. It's free and it helps more people hear these stories of love conquering all.